In this video, I'm going to show you this pen, the Kaweco Sport AL, and then show you the fantastic nib I got for it, a steel semi-flex from fpnibs.com, which is a wonderful company out of Spain that specializes in all kinds of custom nib grinds. As a bonus, I'm also going to show you this neat little case and the other items I keep there, along with this pen, that make it a fantastic, compact, portable sketching kit. My interest in the Kaweco brand is fairly recent and began with this pen, the Kaweco Sport Brass. I wanted a pocket pen that was truly a pocket pen, one that I can throw into my pocket with my car keys that would stand up to the demands of working outdoors and of a messy art studio. This pen has been a delight, an indestructible workhorse that has become an indispensable everyday carry. I have a full review of it on my channel, but to summarize, a number of hacks have made it even better. The first is that I've replaced the original nib with a vintage gold semi-flex nib. The second is that I made a squeeze converter for it that doubles the ink capacity. Something important now that this pen has a semi-flex nib. This is a wonderful pen that after just half a year of use has already developed a lovely vintage looking patina, and I'm looking forward to seeing how it ages over the years. There is a slight problem with this pen, however. It is very heavy. When I first started working with it, it felt wildly clunky and it took some time to get used to the unusual weight and balance. So long as I use this regularly and exclusively, it's not an issue. However, every time I'm away from it for a while, I find that I have to go through an adjustment period. While there's always some period of adjustment when switching pens, this one is relatively lengthy and it takes me at least 20 minutes of drawing for the pen to become an extension of my hand. So, as much as I love this pen, it made me wonder how its lighter siblings would perform. Since I didn't want to give up the element of sturdiness and still wanted something that felt substantial, I decided to go with the aluminum model. There's a reason why Kaweco Sports are so popular with artists. Just like in the Brass Sport, the ergonomics of this pen are excellent, with a comfortable section and polished threads that don't dig into your fingers. I like that the pen body is only a touch wider than the section because I often sneak my fingers back when I'm drawing in order to have better control over certain lines. The pen is surprisingly also pretty comfortable to use unposted, being just long enough for the back end to tuck into the fold between your thumb and your index finger. While the unpolished brass model has a pleasant tackiness to it, the matte finish on the aluminum model is slightly more slippery. The main advantage, however, of this model is that it's less than half the weight of the Kaweco brass, which makes it much more nimble in the hand and doesn't require that long adjustment period. I can grab it and feel comfortable from the get-go. The Kaweco brass is fantastic, and I love the warm feel of it in the hand, the beautiful patina, and its feel of indestructibility. But the AL is probably the more practical option for those that don't enjoy the weight and don't care about the Kaweco brass's vintagey appeal. Like the Kaweco brass, the ink capacity of this pen leaves much to be desired. The plastic versions of these pens are often eyedroppered, giving them a very large ink capacity, but the metal versions, other than possibly the one made from stainless steel, cannot be given the eyedropper treatment. So we're left with using either these short international cartridges or this teeny tiny dinky converter. I am not a fan of cartridges. The range of inks is fairly limited, particularly the waterproof inks that I like using, and these short cartridges have paltry ink capacity. My apologies in advance for going on an environmentalist tangent, but I think this is something everyone regardless of ideology can get behind. One of the reasons I like fountain pens is that they can be used for a lifetime, as opposed to mountains of disposable junk accumulating around us. Single-use plastic cartridges are just another completely unnecessary source of plastic in our landfills, and we should do away with them entirely. This converter, despite being reusable, is an even worse option, however. Impossible to fill all the way, and even then, with a tiny ink capacity even smaller than the cartridge. One solution I've already demonstrated in my review is to make this little squeeze converter. It's easy and inexpensive to make and gives you twice as much capacity as a cartridge. There is perhaps an easier, more elegant solution to the problem of ink capacity. You can refill your cartridges with a syringe. This allows you to place any ink you want in a cartridge, and even better, keeps you from adding plastic to your local landfills. But what if you're going on a sketching excursion and want to take a few refilled cartridges along with you? Well, you can reseal them. I saw a number of videos offering a number of solutions to resealing fountain pen cartridges, and to my mind, the very best option is from a channel called FP Physicist, which calls for using a glue gun. It works very well and is the option I recommend. Glue solidifies in a few seconds and stays in place, even when the cartridge is squeezed and shaken. I'll have to test it to see if this is a trustworthy solution for long-term storage, but given that silicone is waterproof and has good resistance to chemicals, it should stand up very well. The only trick, which that video recommends, is to make sure to add a little extra glop of silicone so you can grab it with your fingernails to pull it off. Bravo to this YouTuber for discovering such a simple, cheap, and elegant solution to what is a pressing artistic and environmental problem. This method allows me to fill a bunch of cartridges with ink of my choice and then take them with me and not worry I'm going to run out of ink. And while I would never throw a bunch of these in my pants pocket, I feel comfortable enough having them bang around in my pen case. Let's talk briefly about the original fine nib this pen came with. In all my pen reviews, I mentioned that I'm looking at the performance of the nib from the perspective of an artist that uses fountain pens almost exclusively for making art. Recently, I came to the realization that I should probably then come up with some tests that are more specific to the requirements of drawing. After some experimentation, here they are, a 4-part standardized test that I'm going to subject all of my nibs to going forward. The first is the speed hatching test, where I put down a bunch of straight lines with increasing speed. Artists move their pens in ways calligraphers and writers do not, and one way we do so is to put down a lot of lines that move side to side. This is very different from the up and down action used in most writing. Artists need to be able to put down lines slowly and carefully, but we also need a pen that can keep up with wild scribbling. This test will see if the nib catches and sprays ink everywhere, or starts skipping, or if the flow doesn't keep up. In the speed hatch test, this pen performed very well, without skipping even at very high scribbling speeds. The next test I call the Flex Cube. I wanted to test the flexibility of the pen as it applies to drawing, and I think this test is way more understandable to artists than the standard figure 8s. I decided to start rating the nibs from 0 to 10. For reference, the Platinum Preppy is a 0, with no line variation at all. A Pilot Falcon is at about a 4, falling just short of being considered semi-flex. The Pilot 912 FA is a 7, being full flex. And the Ultraflex number 6, made by FPR, Fountain Pen Revolution, is at about a 9. The only 10 I have in my collection is a custom steel full flex nib from FP Nibs. And if I ever come up with something flexier, it'll go up to 11. This extra fine nib, surprisingly, has a touch of softness to it, and I managed to get some line variation here. I would rank this at a 2. The next test I call a snap doodle, which will test the nib for snappiness, how quickly it will regain normal line width after flexing. This is also a good test for line elegance and sharpness. This is hard to define, but some pens, like the Noodler's Triple Tail, while being excellent flexors, are hard to control and put down a rough line that lacks calligraphic precision. While other pens, while being really good flexors, are very, very soft, making flex hard to control. While that's not necessarily a bad thing, and is actually good for some applications, this tests a pen responsiveness. How easy is the pen to control? And of course, I couldn't resist adding some figure 8s to the ruffled collar. This nib, as to be expected, was very snappy, and whatever tiny bit of flexibility it had was very easy to control. And lastly, the fourth test, which I call flex hatching. Test the pen for flow. In this test, I put down a bunch of flex lines in rapid succession to see at what point the pen starts to run dry. These lines are probably much faster than any flex pen is really designed for, so even the best pen will fail at some point. But it's good to know where that point is, and to know when to give the pen a rest and allow for the flow to catch up. Since this is not a flex pen, this test will be pretty useless, so I'm going to reserve it for the semi-flex nib I'll be showing you guys later. So all in all, this is a very good nib, capable of producing very delicate crisp lines, equivalent to an extra fine, and with a surprising amount of line variation from a non-flex nib. With pressure, you'll be able to create a line that approaches a medium. The flow is a little bit on the dry side, which is good because it allows the ink to dry quickly, so you can go over it with washes. This is a great option for those of you that like to draw with very fine lines and enjoy building up the values in your drawing with fine layers of cross-hatching. As mentioned at the beginning of this video, the fantastic thing about the Kaweco Sports, what really makes them stand out, is that it's one of the very few modern pens that you can put a number 2 gold vintage nib into. I talk in greater length about this swap in my review of the Kaweco Brass, but in short, the number 2 size was once the most commonly produced nib size, and as a result, there are still tons of them available, some of which can be purchased for as little as $30. These old nibs are excellent, often outperforming modern nibs, and this combo of super sturdy modern pen body with a vintage nib is a really awesome option for those who love vintage pens but are scared to death to breathe on them, let alone use them. I've done this swap successfully quite a few times, and by the way, you can also do the same swap with a Kaweco Liliput. But the problem is, you have to go on a considerable hunt to find just that right number 2 nib, and since the exact dimension of those nibs will vary, there's a risk that the nib won't exactly fit the pen or requires some tinkering to get it working. So, what to do if you don't feel like hunting for a vintage nib, but are looking for a flex nib for your Kaweco Sport? Here's what to do. Buy yourself a steel semi-flex nib for the Kaweco Sport from FP Nibs. This company out of Spain, besides selling pens and accessories, specializes in custom nib grinding, including flex. And while their gold flex nibs can get very expensive, with a full flex number 6 Jovo nib running at well over $300, their steel flex nibs are affordable and work really well. This nib, which came with housing and a feed optimized for flex, cost me 35 EU, which with the weakness of the euro at the moment will cost you about $36. Unfortunately, the shipping costs are high since the company only ships DHL, but you get your order very quickly, and if you order a few things along with the nib, the price becomes justifiable. Like the other steel semi-flex and full flex nibs from FP Nibs, the flex here comes not from thinning out the material, as is done in their gold flex customizations, but through a series of delicate, barely visible cuts. On first inspection, you may not even notice them at all, and it's only upon closely examining the nibs do they become noticeable. Okay, let's take this nib out for a test drive and see how it functions through my 4 tests: the speed hatch, the flex cube, the snap doodle, and the flex hatch. I have 3 other flex nibs from FP Nibs, and while they're all great, they all suffer from the same problem that the tines are quite fragile and have a tendency to, on occasion, catch on the paper fibers and splatter ink. In all 3 nibs, I managed to solve the problem with a little polishing with a micro mesh and mylar. But with this nib, I'm pleased to report that while it does occasionally catch, the tines here are much sturdier. As with the other 3 nibs, I might run this nib on some polishing mylar, which will eliminate the problem altogether. As you can see, the nib puts down a very consistent line even under speed, so you can do quick line work and hatching with it. All in all, a great performer in the speed hatching test. Now let's see how this pen handles the flex cube. The first thing I notice is that this pen has problems with flow, and that possibly the speed hatching test depleted the ink in the feed. This modification by FP Nibs retains the stock plastic Kaweco feed, and whatever additional flow it was given, it's not enough. I'm going to show you how this can be fixed a bit later in the video, but for now, let's just focus on the flex. This semi-flex nib is stiffer than the other steel flex nibs from FP Nibs, and I would give it about a 5 on the scale, meaning that it flexes slightly better than the Pilot Falcon, which is at a 4. A very nice semi-flex nib with decent line variation. Now for the snap doodle, which will test the nib for snapback. Again, a few issues of flow here, but we're going to deal with this later. Unlike some of the modern flex nibs, including even the custom flex gold nibs from FP Nibs, these steel nibs are very snappy, returning to normal unflexed line instantly. Snapback is a bigger issue for calligraphers who require tremendously precise control over line width, but it's also important for artists. Working with a snappy nib is much more pleasant and requires less control. A nib that is too squishy forces you to constantly think about it, which is bad for the drawing process. And now, finally, for the flex hatching test, where I put down lines with increasing pressure until the pen starts to railroad. Here we really see the lack of flow to the nib. Even when I go very slowly, you can see how quickly it will railroad. A number of things can cause poor ink flow, poor choice of ink, or a feed that just doesn't keep up with the demands of the nib. However, one of the more common causes of railroading in modern flex is simply poor contact between the nib and feed, and fortunately for us, this can be easily remedied. I demonstrate how this is done in detail in a previous video, but in short, all it requires is for you to warm up the feed in very hot water and warp it so it gently curves upward. This will ensure tighter contact between the nib and feed, and there will be less risk of railroad. Now let's do a little drawing using this pen so you can fully see it in action. But before I do, I'm going to do an underdrawing using this little mechanical pencil. This is the Kaweco Special Mini 2mm clutch. Like the pen, it's also very well constructed, yet light. And also like the pen, it's just long enough to fit comfortably in the hand despite its diminutive size. I'll have to do a review of all the clutch pencils in my collection since I like using them so much, but this one makes for a very nice pairing with the Kaweco Sport, especially because they fit so snugly into this little leather pen case designed by Kaweco for their Kaweco Sport pens. This case has a very small and slim profile. that fits unobtrusively into a pocket and has quickly become my everyday carry when I want to bring along a pencil and a pen. Another great thing about it, and I don't know if this was made intentionally, but the little loop in the middle that separates the pen and pencil is just wide enough to accommodate 1 or 2 pen cartridges. And while it's designed to hold 2 Kaweco Sports, since the pencil is slightly narrower, you can also fit in a Kaweco Liliput or even this little Kurotaki compact water brush. And since clutch pencils usually don't come with built-in erasers, I can slip in this narrow little eraser holder made by Slendy. Given how many things I can carry in it and how nice it looks, I'm rather enamored with this compact and practical little kit. Now that my pencil underdrawing is complete, let's start inking. This Kaweco, along with a Pilot Custom 74 Soft Fine, produced the finest line width of any flex pen in my collection, the equivalent of the needlepoint grind that you sometimes see in vintage flex nibs. This allows you to sketch in your drawing entirely with pen, something I love to do, even though I didn't do it here. I've been drawing with the Kaweco Brass for the past few weeks, and it's a strange feeling going from the Brass Sport to the AL. I was saying that the very heavy brass takes getting used to when you've been drawing with a lighter pen, but it's also the other way around, but in a good way. It's akin to how wrestlers sometimes wear ankle weights for weeks on end before a competition, the goal being that once they take the weights off, they'll be that much more powerful. With the weight of the brass lifted, my hand somehow feels more nimble and capable of greater dexterity. This is probably a very silly statement, but it could be that there's some benefit to drawing with a heavier object to strengthen the arm and improve dexterity. Perhaps something worth trying and making a video about. Though the feed here has been optimized for flow, the pen still manages to be on the dry side, which for us artists is actually a good thing. The problem with many flex pens, particularly the ones that are vintage, is that they put down very wet lines when flexed, which take a very long time to dry, and when you're working with waterproof ink, that creates a line with a lot of ink residue that can pollute your watercolor washes. With this pen, the lines dry quickly and without residue. All in all, I think this is the most successful steel flex customization that FP Nibs has produced. While it might be the stiffest of the offerings, it's also the smoothest and least prone to catching and splattering. In my review of the other 3 steel flex nibs, I described them as for advanced users who have mastered drawing with flex nibs. This nib is much more forgiving and recommended even for beginning users. Here is my completed drawing. This nib is not perfect, with a little bit of splattering here and there, but as already mentioned, a tiny bit of polishing will entirely correct this problem. All in all, I'm very happy with this Kaweco Sport AL combined with a steel semi-flex nib, and I've enjoyed switching it up with a Kaweco Brass in my everyday drawing kit. For those of you that like their Kaweco Sports, but yearn for a more exciting, flexier nib to go with it, and don't want to go down the risky and time-consuming path of searching for a vintage nib, this is a winning combination. I hope you found my review useful, and if you did, please subscribe and consider donating to my channel. Your support will help me improve my equipment and allow me to dedicate more time to producing quality content. Thanks for watching. If you have any questions or comments, leave them below, and I'll be happy to respond.